Hi everyone and welcome to ExamRevision's Leaving Cert Maths Higher Level Tips and Predictions video for 2025. So just a quick note on the adjustments for 2025, as I'm sure you're all well aware of at this stage, but just a reminder that based on the current adjustments for 2025, you guys will be doing 5 questions out of the available 6 questions, and they will be 30 marks each. So 5 by 30 will give you your 150 marks for section A, and then for section B, which is your context and applications section, which is generally where they'll put a couple of different topics together, you're going to have 4 questions and you're going to do 3 of them. Each one is going to be worth 50 marks, so collectively that will give you your other 150 marks for section B. So you all need to be very aware, and I'm sure you are from your mocks, that both paper 1 and paper 2 has a section A and a section B, so therefore each paper will be worth 300 marks. So just some general tips that we should all be aware of is just making sure that we're reading our questions carefully, whether we're being asked to factorise, solve, simplify. Remember the importance of your attempt marks and, showing as much working as possible, showing the examiner what you're putting into your calculator and where your answers are coming from is always really important. Don't assume later questions have most marks. A lot of the time it's actually the opposite, so don't lose faith if you can't answer the last part of a question. As we said, your exam paper is going to be worth 300 marks and you're going to have 2.5 hours per paper to complete it. So as a general rule, I would say to you for section A, aim to spend about 15 minutes per question, and then for section B, about 20 to 22 minutes per question. And that should allow you to have about 10 minutes at the start of the exam to read through it and figure out what questions that you're going to answer. And then it should also give you some time at the end that maybe if time allows and you feel like you'd like to, you might have time to do another question, or you can use that time to read over and maybe fix up any errors or any questions that you said you'd come back to at a later stage. Do not go into the exam feeling a pressure to do every single question. That is not the way the exam is designed now. So don't feel like you need to get every single question done, because I don't think you will, or you shouldn't really have time to do that. Do track time spent per question, move on and mark to return to later. So definitely for your section A's, don't spend half an hour on one section A, because you're losing valuable time there that you need for your section B's, which are also worth 150 marks. So do make sure that you're kind of roughly speaking tracking your time. As I said already, if you use a calculator, make sure you're showing what you've subbed into your calculator on your paper, because if you get the wrong answer, the examiner won't have any way of knowing what you were doing unless you've shown this was the calculation that I put into my calculator. Use your formula booklet as much as possible. If you're stuck on a question and you're trying to kind of figure out where to go, remember there could be something in there in the formula tables that might jog your memory. Do draw sketches, particularly I would say in your kind of circle, line, area, volume, geometry sections. Sketches can be really helpful. Be very careful with your minus signs. Even Leaving Cert students are going to make mistakes sometimes with the minus signs, so just always be very cautious with that. If you can, do a common sense check with your answers where possible, and always do a quick check at the end that you've implemented the correct degree of accuracy and you've included your units. So what I would always recommend to my students is when they finish a question in the exams and they're about to move on to the next one, you've got 3 things you should always do. Number 1, common sense check for your answer where relevant. Number 2, have you rounded it correctly? And number 3, have I included units where appropriate? So this is your topic breakdown for your exams. So again, these are the rough guide to what you're going to be expecting to see on paper 1 and also what you're expecting to see on paper 2. But as I've written up here, it is possible that some elements of the course may come up on either paper. For example, area, volume, Pythagoras' theorem does tend to feature on paper 1, particularly in the section B's. And you could easily have maybe a little bit of trig in paper 1, and like that you could also very clearly have a bit of algebra in paper 2, a bit of indices and logs. You can have anything, a bit of integration, differentiation. So while this is a good guide when you're studying, do remember that any of these topics could appear on either paper. So what I have here is a general breakdown of the main topic questions that have appeared over the last number of years in exams. And the reason why I like to show students this is I feel like it gives you a good overview of what to expect between question 1 to 6, which is your section A, and for section B, which is question 7 to 10. And it just gives you a good overview of the type of topics that come up. Now look, as I'm sure all your teachers will have said to you about maths, you know, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever way you want to look at it, you know, nearly everything comes up every year. So it's not like you're going to be making these big predictions of, I don't think this topic is going to come up, or I definitely think this topic is going to come up. Pretty much everything features in some small or large capacity on the exam. But I think what's nice looking at this graphic is you can see, okay, in question 1 to 6, which again is my section A questions, we can clearly see that, you know, algebra tends to have at least one question pretty much all to itself, with probably a bit of functions mixed in. We seem to have a sequences and series section A question most years, even though I know in 2023 we didn't. We tend to have a full complex numbers question come up every year. We most of the time would have a differentiation or integration question that would show up quite strongly in section A as well. So look, it's not giving you any groundbreaking predictions here, but it's just more having a look at the type of questions that come up each year. And then if we focus on section B, we can clearly see, yeah, look, financial maths actually has come up the last 2 years in section B. It hadn't featured in a number of years. So that was something that I suppose was kind of being predicted that it was due to come up. That's not to say, though, financial maths, which remember is just a subtopic of sequences and series, but I know people kind of like to segregate them a little bit, but it is literally just sequences and series. We could easily have a bit of financial maths coming into section A maybe this year in a sequence and series question. But again, for looking at your section Bs then, which I know can be harder to study sometimes because they are a mix of topics. So while it's so important to focus on your section A's, and I think they're probably slightly easier to kind of predict, your section B's are going to be a bit of a mix of everything. But again, we can see some trends here that, you know, sequence and series tends to come up as a section B question. And again, I would count financial maths obviously within that. Differentiation and integration is coming up everywhere in section B as part of a bigger question where you might have a bit of an area or volume question, you might have a bit of a functions question, and it's mixing in there. One important thing to say, which you may have noticed from this graphic, is that proof by induction has not featured in the June exam for the last 3 years. Now, again, one important thing just to say here is I have not included the deferred papers as part of this graphic. Proof by induction has come up on the deferred papers. So look, it again, who's to say whether it will or won't come up for you guys this year, but it hasn't come up in the June exam since 2021. So we would be saying that proof by induction probably has quite a high chance of coming up for you guys in June. Then looking at our paper 2 breakdown for higher level, we can see that again, if we look at question 1 to 6, first of all, that we do have a relatively consistent trend where we seem to have a probability or statistics question coming up every year. We have a trigonometry question that seems to come up nearly every year in section A. We have a line question that comes up nearly every year. We have a circle question that nearly comes up every year. And then geometry is the other one that seems to kind of feature as a section A question most years. So again, that's something to, I suppose, just be aware of in your study. And then looking at section B, we can see some trends here that, you know, you can almost predict that trigonometry is going to be at least 1, if not 2 questions in section B. You can see the importance of statistics and probability that are literally coming up every year in section B. And then the other question is probably going to be a mix. Last year actually was the line and circle, which hadn't really featured as a full question for a number of years. So again, maybe for you guys this year, there's a chance that it might go back to something like it had been the previous couple of years, where you might get 2 different questions on stats and probability, or maybe you might get more of it 2 trigonometry questions. So again, look, nothing groundbreaking there, but it just gives you a bit of an idea of what you should be studying for section A's and what you should be studying for section B's. So now what I'm going to do, guys, is just give you a few more pointers specific to the different topics on paper 1 and paper 2. Again, just to reiterate, it's very difficult to make any actual predictions for the Leaving Cert higher level exam, because everything does feature nearly every year in some capacity. But these are things that I would just recommend, the night or two before the exam. These are some things that I've kind of, from going through the papers for the last number of years, these are either topics that I find come up most years, or that maybe haven't featured for a few years. But I would again say this very tentatively, that it's, predictions more so recommendations of maybe little things to focus your attention on in the last little run up to the exam. So in regards to algebra and functions, as we know, the factor theorem shows up pretty much every year. So just make sure you're very comfortable going between roots and factors, and working backwards and forwards and relating a root to a graph and how you can convert that into the equation of the function. Rational inequalities and just inequalities in general is something that we haven't seen in a couple of years, so I definitely would look over that the night before the exam. Logs and indices are always there in some capacity, so just make sure you've gone back over those rules and you're comfortable doing, let's say, the likes of integration and differentiation and stuff with them. Binomial expansion is something that I'd always be recommending to throw your eye over, because it is one of those ones. It's not too tricky, but if you haven't seen it in a little while, it could throw you off. Inverse functions hasn't appeared for a couple of years, so that could be something to just throw your eye over in case it does feature. And also completing the square and the discriminant is something that I haven't seen for a couple of years. So again, make sure you know how to complete the square, and I suppose go back over the format, how that's normally asked in the exam. They won't actually use the word or the words complete the square. They'll give you the format written out using variables, and then your discriminant is obviously related to your quadratic as well, so that could be a question that might come up as like a part 1 and a part 2. For sequences and series, then nothing groundbreaking here, but just to say that I do think it could feature as a section A and a section B question based on previous years. Arithmetic and geometric sequences pretty much come up every year, so really important to be comfortable with the two of them and know the difference between them. And maybe a quadratic is something that it hasn't featured in a couple of years, so it would be worth going back over how to form a quadratic, the equation of a quadratic function or sequence, because that's not in your formula tables, so that's definitely worth looking back over. As I mentioned already, proof by induction has not come up in the June exam for the last 3 years, so we are thinking that that could feature. Proof of De Moivre's theorem is also something that hasn't come up in a number of years, so when you're looking over your proof by induction, I would personally just say go and look over your 3 types of proof by induction. I don't think I'd be making any predictions based on which one, but I would be recommending look over the 3 of them and look over the proof of De Moivre's theorem as well. In regards to complex numbers, it's pretty much a guaranteed section A question, so I think it's really worthwhile looking over the last number of years complex numbers questions, just to make sure you are kind of happy with every version of what can come up. But some of the main things just to make sure you're throwing your eyes back over is De Moivre's theorem and polar form, and being able to multiply, divide in polar form. And also something that I think has a good chance coming up is maybe something to do with the conjugate root theorem, which is obviously very popular, but also it's worth looking at roots with complex conjugates. So rather than just looking at what will fit into the conjugate root theorem, also look at how you would figure out roots with complex coefficients. So that's where you won't be able to apply the conjugate root theorem. So have a look at the 2016 question on that. And as I mentioned previously, proof of De Moivre's theorem as well could feature. Obviously, differentiation and integration feature heavily on paper 1 every year, so there's nothing, major sticking out from that, but just do go back over all of your practice on turning points, stationary points, max min, points of inflection. You're going to get something on that somewhere on the paper. Make sure you go back over how to differentiate trig, functions, logs, indices, exponentials, etc., because again, they come up very, very frequently. Potentially could have a related rates of change question in differentiation this year, so do look back over it. And again, quotient rules showed up last year. Maybe a product rule could come up this year as a part A of a section A question. Then looking at integration, again, features heavily on the exam every year. Make sure you can do your integration basics and that you can apply that to your, trig functions, logs, etc. I would definitely have a look over the trapezoidal rule and the integration kind of linked questions, as that hasn't featured for a year or two. Your average value also tends to come up quite frequently on the exam, so do look back over how to calculate the average value. And area under a curve and between two curves does tend to come up very frequently as well. So last year it was an area between two curves, so look, that does come up year after year, but it could be an area under a curve this year. And another one I just look at that hasn't come up in a few years is finding the equation of a function. So it's where they give you the slope function and then you have to use integration to go backwards to find the original equation of the function. That could be something that might feature. And then financial maths, as I said, it's come up the last 2 years as section B. There's a chance it mightn't show up at all this year, or maybe it could be put in as part of a section A question with sequence and series. So I certainly wouldn't be writing it off as a topic because it's absolutely something that could come up, but maybe it might feature as a section A rather than a section B. So just before we get on to looking at some of the breakdown notes on paper 2, just want to highlight some of the features on ExamRevision, our website, where you can access lots of resources linked with maths and lots of other Leaving Cert subjects. So this is just to show you what you're going to get on our complete revision package as a user on ExamRevision. So if you take out an account with ExamRevision, you will be receiving access to bite-sized video tutorials, PowerPoint presentations, H1 notes, exam and mock paper questions, marking schemes, quizzes, reflection logs, and smart adaptive technology. And we do have a range of junior and Leaving Cert subjects. So here are all our junior cycle subjects that are available to access for anyone doing their junior cycle exams. And for you guys, these are the subjects we have available for Leaving Cert. So as I said, Leaving Cert Maths is available, and there's lots of other subjects up there as well that could come in very handy in the lead up to the exams. And you can use the code 2025 tips for 10% off a package. Here are some examples of our 5-star reviews, and I suppose, look, the main thing to kind of acknowledge there is that people really appreciate having access to a wide range of resources when getting ready for their exams. You see Lucy here said, saved my dreams of staying in higher level maths, helped me go from a H7 to a H4, over the moon with that result. Thank you so much for your amazing videos. So that's, really lovely for us to hear and to know that it is helping students. And Tara said, the best overall way to study. It teaches you through videos, quizzes, PowerPoints and H1 standard notes. Lets you learn at your own pace and you can focus on the topics you find hard. It has the entire course available to you and really helped me with Leaving Cert Economics and Business. So it could really come in handy now in the last month or two coming up to your exams. So now, just to finish off, we're going to have a quick look at some tips and topics to consider looking at for paper 2. But as I said already, it is really important to note that these are really just me maybe pointing you in the right direction of some things that do feature quite heavily each year on the exam, or maybe some few ideas of things that haven't come up in a few years. But it is really important, as always, that we're studying as much content as possible, and this is just kind of really the couple of days before the exams, these might be just some things that you might be able to focus a little bit of your attention on. So with probability and statistics, we know it features heavily on paper 2 every year between section A and section B. One thing that hasn't come up in a few years for probability is the idea of tree diagrams. So that's just something maybe to have a look back on old questions. Same with combinations as well. Again, it may or may not appear, but it's just something that hasn't shown up on the exam in a few years. Venn diagram, the whole idea of like probabilities, putting them onto a Venn diagram, conditional, mutually exclusive, independent. Make sure you're going back over all of those formulae, and you know how to prove if something is mutually exclusive or if something is an independent event. So just go back over those. They do tend to feature nearly every year in some capacity, so it's really important that you do know how to apply those formulae. Expected value is also something that comes up very frequently, and also Bernoulli trials. So again, just the night or two before the exam, make sure you're having a quick look over those. In regards to statistics then, we know normal distribution comes up every year, so it's important that you're looking over your normal distribution, your standard normal distribution, your z-scores, being able to convert between them. Calculating the standard deviation is something that I definitely recommend looking over on how to do on your calculator. The empirical rule, again, it does tend to feature more so on ordinary level, but it has come up as a higher level question. So I suppose just make sure you're going back over your percentages in case that does come up. And then we know that nearly every year you're going to have some type of a confidence interval or a hypothesis test. So make sure you're looking at the two different versions of those, where you've got your mean or you've got your proportion questions. So do be very confident doing both of those, because it is such a common question, and once you've gone over the kind of layout, the questions tend to be quite similar and easy to pick up marks on. In relation to trigonometry, it again is something that features very heavily on paper 2. Just make sure you're going back over all of your basic trigonometry rules for your right angle triangles, Pythagoras, so Katoa, and also for non-right angle triangles using your sine rule, your cosine rule, your area of a triangle formula. Trigonometry does tend to come up with, an area and volume question, functions questions. So look at those section B questions, to be familiar with how you may see trigonometry featuring on section B. 3D trigonometry is something that hasn't come up in a few years, so that could definitely be something that may feature. But just remember, we don't know new formulae for 3D trig. It's just you turn it into a 2D question and use all the formulae that I've mentioned already. Maybe something to consider that could come up is like transformations of trig graphs. So make sure you're happy with graphing your trig graphs and then understanding how they are impacted by different transformations. Again, worth having a quick look over how to prove your sine and cosine rule. And we have all of our different trig formulae, and perhaps proof of cos A minus B or cos A plus B could be something that might feature this year, just looking at what's come up in the previous number of years. Maybe that could be something that could show up for us this year. The line and circle, again, I'd be saying to you, go back over all your formulae and your formula tables, just make sure you're familiar with what's in there. Angle between two lines hasn't come up for a few years. Maybe an intersection between a line and circle question. Problem solving using GF and C is very popular, and maybe something to do with chords or tangents could be something that may feature this year based on what's come up the last few years. So just go back over your notes from your circle chapter and just make sure you're comfortable being able to work out the equation of a tangent, where it's either a point on the circle or a point off the circle, and also any of those problem solving to do with chords of circles. And finally, geometry is, a topic that I know on the paper sometimes students love the question and sometimes people hate them. Theorem 11 came up last year with the construction, so maybe theorem 12 or 13 this year, but there's also a chance that maybe no theorem or construction comes up. Again, it's very hard to know. So look, I would say, probably it won't be theorem 11, but you never know. So like theorem 12 or 13 would probably be the most likely. congruent triangles could feature, because similar triangles came up last year. And then, as always, just make sure you go back over how to calculate with spheres, cones, cylinders, and how sometimes similar triangles can help us in those questions. And then circles, sectors, arcs, all those little things can show up as a small part of section B. So it's definitely worth looking over some of those questions when you are studying for your paper too.